So ladies, once again, it's early in the morning, and I have another message for you here. I title this one, Niceness, and it's taken really as more of an explanation of my two previous messages on a Father's Devotions called The God Who Is, Part 1 and Part 2. You know, I got to thinking about what makes people nice as opposed to not nice, and I thought I would give you what I consider to be a biblical overview of what it really is. You know, throughout my life, I have known people who have known famous people, who have met them and talked with them. And my question to these people is always, well, when you met that famous person, were they nice? And it sounds like a real shallow question on the surface, but it really isn't. When you ask if somebody's nice, if you really want to get technical about it, you're really asking a whole host of things. And to give you, as I stated earlier, a biblical perspective on what I feel to be what niceness really is, I take for my examples Job, Isaiah, and Paul, as well as the apostles during Christ's time. I mean, Paul and the rest of the apostles. And it's kind of interesting, with Job and Isaiah, and really even Paul, all three of these men, at least initially, thought they knew God. They had heard about him, they were his spokesmen, obviously in the case of Isaiah and whatnot. But the point is that when they encountered that God, who they thought they were in the service of, it changed their lives. You look at Job, in chapter 42, he said, well, I heard about you, but when I saw you, I was undone. He was convicted of his sin. He was convicted of his unrighteousness. Again, you can read that, Job 42, and then, of course, Isaiah, who was called to be a prophet. And yet in Isaiah chapter 6 and Isaiah 64, and I know I've quoted these verses before, but again, like Job, he was undone. He was convicted of his sin. I mean, it brought him really, I think, to his knees, where he said, all our righteousness is as filthy rags. And then, of course, Paul spent his whole life studying the Word of God. He was the learned of the learned, most likely a PhD type of individual. And yet, when he encountered the God that he thought he knew on the road to Emmaus, he was knocked off his horse onto the ground, he was blinded, and he was a changed man. And I guess the one thing that all three of these individuals had in common, when they encountered God, not just studied about him and not just knew about him from other people, but when they really did encounter the mind of the universe, they were humbled. They were humbled because they knew beyond a doubt, in a very horrible and unsettling way, that all their efforts at righteousness really didn't amount to anything. And I think that had one major effect on them, and that was that it showed them where they really stood. And it showed them, too, where they really stood among other people. I mean, Paul said that God shows no favoritism. And Paul, in 1 Timothy 1:15, called himself the chief of sinners. He didn't say, I was the chief of sinners. He says, I am the chief of sinners. It's in the present. And I think because of that, all three of these men were nice people. And they were nice because they were humble individuals. So I think a chief attribute of niceness, right, when you ask if somebody is nice or not, which I think, again, is a very sophisticated question to ask, even though perhaps some of the elite might laugh at that. You're asking, are they humble? Do they see themselves in the correct relation in regards to God, and then obviously in regards to other people? And I think nice people, because they are humble, another attribute of that is that they show mercy. You look at the Lord's Prayer, and what does the Lord say? That we are to forgive one another our debts. Well, what are you doing when you forgive somebody? You're acting in mercy toward that person. So I think another chief attribute of niceness is not just humility, but it's a humility that brings about mercy in the way you treat other people. And I think, too, the apostles were nice as well, because like Paul, like Job, like Isaiah, they had encountered the one true God. They had seen him in the flesh, seen him after he rose again, and it changed their lives. Like Paul, like Isaiah, like Job, it humbled them. And like these three individuals, it showed them where they really were in relation to God and in relation to others around them. Just some food for thought. God bless you both.